The idea of returning to the past. Could such a thing ever be achieved with an actual time machine? In 2022, a man who had been missing for 29 years knocked on a stranger's door in rural Ohio, carrying a wooden case filled with journals, diagrams, and proof of things that should not be possible. His name was Mike Markham. He was last seen in 1997, the night he walked into a machine he had constructed inside his own garage and simply vanished. When investigators secured the property, they discovered the garage had been burned to its foundations, a ruin of melted copper, obliterated transformers, and a 6-foot circular scorch mark seared into the concrete floor. There was no body, no remains of any kind, only a handwritten note found inside a metal toolbox which read, "It's not about time, it's about how you see things." For 3 decades, the official assumption was that he was dead. But Mike Markham had come back older, exhausted, and carrying proof. I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen. Maybe save his life. Not proof of time travel, but of something that makes time travel seem like a children's story. What he found during those 29 years he was gone is why this account must be heard from the very beginning, the discovery. Mike Markham came of age in rural Missouri during the 1970s and 80s. He held no degrees, received no funding. He was just a kid with a dangerous obsession for electricity who scavenged transformers from junkyards, taught himself electronics from library books, and devoted every free hour to building anything capable of throwing a spark. And at some point in the early 1990s, that singular obsession guided him towards something he was never intended to find. He had built what is known as a Jacob's ladder, 2 metal rods configured in a V-shape, a high-voltage current, and an arc of electricity that climbs between them. It is standard equipment in the study of physics, nothing out of the ordinary. But one night, working alone in that garage, Mike aimed a common laser pointer so that its beam passed through the climbing arc. The humming sound of the transformers changed in pitch. The arc, which by its nature should have been chaotic and unstable, suddenly tightened, became steady, transformed into something that felt almost deliberate. And that is when Mike observed something that no textbook had ever described. A steel washer resting on the workbench near the arc flickered. It hadn't been moved by vibration, nor was it disturbed by airflow. It was simply there, and then, for a fraction of a second, it was not. Then it was back. He froze. He tried it again. Screws, coins, various small metal objects were placed between the rods. And on occasion, for just a heartbeat, they would vanish. No sound, no motion, only a brief and impossible absence. It was a hole in the fabric of reality where a solid object had been. And then the object was back, exactly as it was, as if nothing at all had happened, except that the air in the garage now smelled sharper, ozone, and something else that Mike could not put a name to, something that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. That was the moment Mike Markham's life was split in two. There was everything before and everything after. But here was the problem. He had no idea what he had found. He just knew it was real, and he needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. The call. In January of 1995, Mike picked up the telephone and called Coast to Coast AM, the legendary late-night radio program hosted by Art Bell, a man who, for years, had listened to every kind of impossible claim from every kind of caller. Mike was nervous, his words fumbling. He told Art that he had assembled a device in his garage that could cause objects to vanish from reality for fractions of a second and then reappear unchanged. Art leaned into the story. How do you know the object disappears? Could it just be an optical illusion from the arc? Mike's answer caused Art to go quiet. I know it disappears because I can feel it, Mike said. When the field hits right, everything in the garage feels wrong. The air feels like it's holding its breath. And I'm not the only one who notices. My dog won't come near the garage anymore. Birds won't land on the roof. Something about that field makes living things want to be somewhere else. There was dead air, a real pause. Then Art said, carefully, Mike, I want you to document everything. Bring in witnesses, record video, and call me back. Now, if you are the type of person who is drawn to stories like this, you need to subscribe right now, because what Mike did next changed everything. And this story is nowhere close to being over. Over the following year, Mike's experiments escalated to a dangerous degree. He was no longer satisfied with making objects flicker. He was driven to understand it, to control it, to amplify it, and to do that, he needed more power, far more than his scavenged equipment could ever deliver. In the summer of 1995, he stole 6 industrial transformers from a rural electrical substation and wired them directly into his garage. When he powered the system on, it drew so much energy it created a brownout across several neighboring properties. Lights flickered for a quarter of a mile. Utility investigators traced the surge directly to Mike's garage. He was arrested and served 60 days in county jail. And the key detail is this: those 60 days made him worse. He spent every waking hour inside that cell sketching diagrams, refining his calculations, planning a bigger build. He emerged from the experience a changed man, consumed by an obsession that had taken root. By the latter half of 1995, Mike had reassembled his apparatus, this time with legitimate components, superior control systems, and more accurate laser stabilizers. And when he next contacted Art Bell, the radio host sensed a distinct shift. Markham's tone was different. It was lower, more rapid, tinged with a note of desperation. "The objects don't just flicker now, Art," Mike explained. "They vanish for seconds at a time, sometimes more. And when they reappear," he continued, "sometimes they're altered." He recounted an experiment involving a wooden block positioned between the arcs. It simply ceased to exist. For 3 entire seconds, there was only a void, a space filled with the low drone of the transformers and the electric snap of the arc where a physical object once was. Upon its return, Mike retrieved the block. It was unnaturally cold to the touch, a deep chill that defied the ambient temperature, as if it had been transported to a frozen dimension. His next test subject was a flower. The flower vanished, only to return withered and desiccated, its state suggesting the passage of days, not mere seconds. But it was Mike's next admission that truly unnerved Art Bell. He had tested the device on a living creature. A mouse, placed between the arcs, disappeared for 5 seconds. When it rematerialized, it was alive, but fundamentally damaged. It spun uncontrollably, collided with the walls of its enclosure, and rejected all sustenance. "The animal perished 2 days later, Mike," Art said, and the change in the host's voice was palpable. It was a mixture of fear and profound concern. "You cannot continue these experiments alone. You need to involve legitimate scientists, get some form of oversight. This has gone far beyond a garage project." A stretch of silence hung on the line before Mike's quiet response. "I can't stop now, Art. I'm on the verge of something." And he was. He was close, but the precipice he stood on was not the one he imagined. The last transmission and the disappearance. In the final days of February 1996, Mike placed his last call to Coast AM. The content of that conversation would startle even Art Bell's seasoned audience, a listenership accustomed to the bizarre. Mike claimed he had expanded the field of effect. The phenomenon was no longer confined to small objects. He asserted that he could now physically enter a portion of it himself. And within that space, he said, the perception of time altered. "It's as if the world decelerates around you," Mike reported. "You witness events unfold in slow motion. You can navigate between the seconds. And upon exiting, it becomes clear that more time has elapsed externally than you perceived internally. It's a sensation of having been absent for longer than you remember." A heavy silence filled the airwaves. Then, Art Bell posed the question that hung in the mind of every listener. "Mike, are you saying you've constructed a time machine?" A considerable pause followed before the carefully worded reply. "I'm not certain it's time travel, but it's a phenomenon. The field interferes with either standard perception or reality itself. The distinction is unclear, but I am close, Art. All I require is increased power and a more refined stabilizer." Bell attempted to reason with him, urging him to involve the scientific community, to operate within established protocols. But a deep-seated paranoia had already taken hold of Mike. He spoke of government surveillance, unmarked vehicles on his street, figures observing his home. The conversation concluded with a pledge. "I will contact you again in March," he promised. "I will have definitive proof, video evidence, precise measurements, everything you've requested." That call was never made. By March of 1997, Mike Markham had gone dark. His phone line was cut. Correspondence was returned to sender. The farmhouse appeared deserted. Shortly thereafter, the garage was consumed by fire. An investigation of the scene revealed pools of molten copper, obliterated transformers, and a distinctive 6-foot circular scorch mark burned into the concrete floor. There was no sign of a body, No trace of Mike. The only item recovered was a handwritten note found secured inside a metal toolbox. The case was officially closed. A missing person report was filed but never actively investigated. In the nascent world of the internet, however, the story ignited. By the summer of 1997, Mike Markham had become a digital ghost story, a legend. Theories proliferated. Time travel, government black ops, interdimensional gateways. Every theorist had an explanation. None had any evidence. And then, the mythology surrounding the case took an even more bizarre turn. In 1998, an online researcher unearthed a newspaper clipping dated from the 1930s. It described an unidentified body that had washed ashore on a California beach. The deceased was a male in his early 30s, dressed in clothing described as strangely contemporary for the era. Found in his pocket was a small, rectangular metal object adorned with buttons and cryptic symbols. When an enhanced photograph from the article circulated online, observers noted a chilling detail. The device bore a striking resemblance to something a home electronics enthusiast from the 1990s might construct. The question was unavoidable. Had Mike Markham somehow traveled to 1930, only to perish there, decades before his own birth? Now, what follows is critical, because in September of 2006, after years of silence, there was a development. A man known online as the Signal Doctor, in reality Harold Voss, a physics professor at a small university in Oregon with a blog dedicated to fringe science, was seated at his desk on a Tuesday morning. He opened his inbox, and a cold shock ran through him. The sender's name read, Mike Markham. The message began, I am aware that I am presumed dead. I am not, but my existence is displaced. The device was successful, but its function was not what I anticipated. I am transmitting diagrams to you, a third-generation vortex stabilization frame. Do not attempt to construct it, only study it. Comprehend what I failed to. The email contained attachments, technical schematics of a complexity far beyond anything Mike had ever alluded to on the radio. There were intricate circuit designs, complex field equations, and stark warnings regarding the severe biological consequences for living tissue. Dr. Voss read the email through 3 times. By the second reading, his hands were trembling. An attempt to reply failed. The message bounced back as undeliverable. The IP was traced to a public library in Kauai, Hawaii. When authorities investigated, they found nothing. No one remembered a man who fit Mike's description. It was another dead end, another ghost in the system. And then, just as the trail went cold, everything changed. He returned. October 2022. 29 years after Mike Markham disappeared, a young couple in their early 30s, Andrew and Melanie Carter, had recently bought an old farmhouse in the Ohio countryside. They were in the middle of an attic renovation, tearing out old insulation. That's when Melanie's hand struck something hard, concealed behind the wall. It was a heavy wooden box, buried under decades of dust, with a label handwritten in faded ink. M. Markham, do not open until the right time. Kneeling on the attic floor, they pried it open. Inside were journals, crammed with handwritten notes, complex circuit diagrams, and a timeline of dates stretching from 1995 to 2021. There were also circuit boards. Some were scorched, others looked brand new, carefully sealed in anti-static bags. And there was a Polaroid photograph of a man standing next to a large, ring-shaped metal structure. The date stamp read June 21st, 2021. On the back, in that same distinct handwriting, were the words, "It did work, but not the way I thought it would." But this is where the story takes a turn into the truly inexplicable. One of the journals listed the exact street address of the very farmhouse the Carters now owned. Beside the address was a note, magnetic field stability optimal, safe storage location. They will find it when the time is right. But how could Mike have known this address? How could he have known the Carters would one day buy this specific house? And how did a box, presumably hidden years ago, contain documents dated as recently as 2021? Andrew and Melanie took their discovery to Reddit. The post exploded. Within days, individuals who had followed the Mike Markham case for decades began making contact. Then, 3 weeks later, Andrew's phone rang. The screen showed no caller ID. The voice on the line was weary, worn down by time. But it was a voice that was unmistakable to anyone who had listened to those old late-night radio interviews. "This is Mike Markham. I hear you found my box. I'd like to explain what happened. Can I come visit?" He arrived at the Carters' farmhouse on a cool evening in October of 2022. He was 59 years old, the correct age had he simply lived a normal life since 1997. But he appeared far older. His features were weathered, hollowed out, as if he were a man eroded by something no one else could ever perceive. What he revealed to Andrew and Melanie over the course of the next several hours would redefine everything they thought they knew. According to Mike, he had not traveled through time, at least not in any conventional sense. "The machine didn't move me through time," Mike explained. "It desynchronized me from everyone else. I was still here, same places, same moments, but I was out of phase, like a radio tuned just off the frequency. You can still hear the music, but it's distorted, distant. You're present, but not entirely there." He recounted the night of the fire in March of 1997. It was his third-generation machine. The field had finally stabilized, and Mike, in a single moment of reckless certainty, stepped completely inside its perimeter. There was no flash of light, no physical sensation of movement. There was only a quiet, nauseating feeling of disconnection, as if the entire world had shifted 1 inch to the left while he remained perfectly still. When he stepped back out, his surroundings appeared identical, but several hours had inexplicably passed. The machine had overheated and sparked the fire. Mike managed to escape, but when he tried to reach out to people, he discovered that something was profoundly, fundamentally broken. Friends would see his face and recognize it, but they couldn't retrieve his name. His landlord recalled renting the apartment to someone, but the specific details were gone. His phone calls went to numbers that were now disconnected. It was as if Mike's very existence was being systematically erased from the perception of others. "I didn't disappear," Mike clarified. "I became hard to find, hard to remember. It's like your brain couldn't quite hold on to the concept of me. And every time I used the machine on myself, the effect compounded. I became a little less real to the world." Over the years, this desynchronization only worsened. He couldn't hold a job. His coworkers would forget he even worked there. He couldn't maintain a bank account because the clerks had no memory of ever opening one for him. He became a drifter, surviving on cash jobs and temporary rooms, a life lived in places where no one needed to remember him. And through it all, he never stopped his research, obsessed with understanding the true nature of what he had done to himself. What he eventually uncovered was a truth more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The machine didn't alter time. It altered something far more essential. It altered perception, memory, and the quantum probability states that determine if a person can be observed, acknowledged, and held in the minds of other conscious beings. "Every person exists because others remember them," Mike told the Carters. "Memory is what solidifies reality, and I damaged my own ability to be remembered. You can see me right now, we're talking, but this connection is fragile, and it's deteriorating." The Carters then asked the question that hung in the air: why return now? Mike explained that he was almost out of time. Each exposure had amplified the effect. He could barely maintain a coherent presence to anyone for more than a few hours. Soon, he would become completely unmemorable present, but unperceivable, an entity existing only in the empty spaces between people's thoughts. He had orchestrated this moment years in advance. He hid the box and waited, trusting that the right people would discover it, people who would get his story on the record before he faded completely into the void of the unremembered. Before his departure, he issued 3 directives to the Carters. The journals were to be sent to a private research archive. This was a place for individuals who would analyze his work, not carelessly attempt to reproduce it. The attic was to be locked, certain pieces of equipment remained magnetically charged, and finally, they were to make no attempt to ever find him again. They consented. Mike expressed his gratitude, rose to his feet, and walked out into the night. Unmemory. This is the element of the case that penetrates the psyche. Andrew and Melanie Carter reported the exact same cognitive phenomena. The very instant Mike Markham crossed the threshold of their front door and vanished from sight, a conscious effort was required to recall his physical appearance. His face began to erode from their memory almost immediately, an experience they likened to grasping at smoke. His features smeared, the specifics dissolving away. Within a matter of minutes, the specifics were already beginning to fracture, dissolving into mist. Melanie's hands fumbled for a notepad, her mind racing to capture every fragment before it was gone forever. The jacket was now a colorless void in his memory. The shape of his hands, an indistinct blur. Andrew stood frozen in the kitchen, his gaze locked on a blank wall, straining to pull the sound of Mike's voice from the silence. It was inaccessible. In less than an hour, they were examining their own notes as if they'd been written by a total stranger. The script was theirs. They knew the pen, the paper. They could even identify a small coffee stain in the corner of the page. But the memory that gave those words meaning was disintegrating, not erased, but thinning, like a photograph fading to white, leaving nothing but a void. After 1 week, consulting those notes became the only way to reconstruct the conversation in any capacity. The emotional resonance of the event, the fear, the wonder, the profound gravity of Mike's confession was breaking down into something abstract and hollow. It was like awakening from a dream you instinctively know held deep significance, yet are utterly incapable of describing. Today, years after the fact, they describe the encounter as an event that feels secondhand, as if it happened to someone else. A film they vaguely recall watching in the middle of the night. They are certain of its reality only because of the artifacts left behind. The journals exist. The Polaroid exists. Their own handwritten records exist. But the visceral memory of sitting in the same room as Mike Markham, of hearing his speech and seeing his face, has been almost entirely purged. This is the nature of unmemory. It is not forgetting. It is something far more sinister. It is the methodical, silent erasure of a person's existence from your consciousness, even as the physical proof of their life remains directly in front of you. If you've remained with us this far, subscribe, because the cases examined on this channel do not merely recount events, they document what should be impossible. The Mike Markham file leaves us confronting a question that has no relation to temporal mechanics. The question is more fundamental and profoundly more disturbing. What is the outcome when the very thing that validates your existence to others, their capacity to see you, to recall you, to hold an impression of you in their minds, simply fails? Mike's case suggests an answer. You do not vanish. You do not cease to be. You simply become impossible to retain. A face that no one can adequately picture. A name that feels foreign on the tongue. A presence that dissipates the second you exit their field of view. You become a phantom of flesh and bone, haunting a reality that has fundamentally lost its ability to register you. The Carters honored their pact. The journals were dispatched. The attic was sealed. In the years since, there have been sporadic, unsubstantiated reports. A person fitting Mike's profile, posing strange inquiries at university physics labs. A man at a professional conference who gave his name as Mike Markham, but whom no one could later recall meeting. Accounts from homeless shelters detailing a man possessing advanced technical expertise who never remained in one place long enough for a name to be learned. These are fragments, echoes, with each report becoming progressively vaguer than the one before it. Each witness grows a little less convinced they encountered anyone at all. It is the fading signature of a man descending deeper into unmemory. Somewhere, Mike Markham is still moving through a world that can only perceive him in glimpses. Still alive, still functioning, still struggling to be remembered before the final connection severs and he slips through the fabric of existence entirely. Living, breathing, and yet completely, irreversibly forgotten. The machine was a success, but not in any way its creator had intended, and the consequence was a state of being worse than non-existence. Mike Markham discovered a way to fracture reality, and in turn, reality fractured him. The haunting odyssey of Mike Markham serves as a profound warning to a world obsessed with the what-ifs of history. When you chase the ghosts of yesterday, you risk becoming a ghost yourself. Mike sought to master time, to reach back and rewrite what was already written, but in his pursuit, he fractured the very essence of his humanity, his connection to others. His story teaches us that we aren't made real by the blood in our veins or the air in our lungs, but by the space we hold in the hearts and memories of those around us. Reality is a shared frequency, a delicate bond of presence and recognition. To be unremembered is a fate far colder than death. It is to be a phantom of flesh and bone, screaming into a world that has lost the ability to hear you. We often build our own machines, obsessions, regrets, and digital voids that desynchronize us from the people standing right in front of us. But the present is the only timeline that truly matters. Don't wait for a miracle to realize that being known is life's greatest luxury. Cherish the eyes that see you and the voices that call your name today. In the end, the most powerful machine isn't made of copper and sparks, it is the human heart, and it only beats in the here and now.